Hey everybody, we just would like to let you know we're officially now on iTunes, we're also on SoundCloud, and we're also on YouTube. You can look us up at Palm Beach County Young Dems or PBCYD. If you could leave us a rating or a review or comments about our interviews, it is greatly appreciated. We've witnessed the reemergence of fascist politicians across the world within the past 10 years. Most notably, the recently elected Jair Bolsonaro, who is running the world's fourth largest democracy in Brazil. Here in our own country, depending on who you ask, Donald Trump would be labeled a fascist. I recently spoke with Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a historian who's an expert on fascist politics, regarding these troubling trends and on the history of fascism. So, you're a historian over at New York University. Your specialty is in fascism and its history, specifically Italian fascism. What got you interested in history, specifically Italian fascism?
So I grew up in California, Southern California, in a town that had a lot of famous emigres from Nazism, like Thomas Mann and really famous intellectuals. A lot of them were there. Of course, I was too young to know them. But I kept hearing, as I grew up, all the stories about these men and women who had to flee from dictatorship. So I got interested in fascism, understood broadly, including Nazism, just from that, from being in California, with no family contact at all to Nazism or fascism or the Holocaust, nothing like that. And then when I went to graduate school in history, I decided to specialize in Italy because there really wasn't that much done on the subject, and it lasted twice as long as Nazism. It lasted over 20 years, so I thought that was interesting to study a whole generation.
So you're differentiating fascism and Nazism. Could you explain to me what the difference is?
Well, fascism, we just had the 100th anniversary. It was founded in 1919 by Mussolini, and it was the first ever attempt to take certain ideas from socialism, which existed only in doctrine, like the idea of revolution and certain things to do with labor policy, because Mussolini had been a socialist, and combine them with nationalism and imperialism. And these things had never gone together, and so people were very, very confused whether fascism, what it was. But it became very clear that from day one they were busting the heads and killing socialists and the left. So it was very obvious very quickly that it was a right-wing movement. And Nazism didn't get into power for 11 years after Mussolini, so Hitler copied a lot of things. And he added the kind of obsession with race. So that became the main identifying characteristic of Nazism. And for fascism, it came a little bit later, the racism.
So you mentioned that Benito Mussolini used to be a socialist, and obviously he created fascism. So I have two questions on that. One, what would drive Benito Mussolini from socialism, which is a left-wing movement, as you're saying, to fascism, creating fascism, which is a right-wing movement? What caused that shift?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. At the time in Europe, there were two kinds of socialism. There was revolutionary socialism, that believed in violent struggle, and that was Mussolini. And then there were reformists who thought, okay, almost like social democrats, we can work within the system. Mussolini was always into violence and like armed struggle. But he got kicked out of the Socialist Party because socialists everywhere do not believe in international conflict. Because if you go to war like World War I, it means that a French worker is fighting a German worker. And so socialists were obliged to not support World War I. Mussolini thought this was a great opportunity, so he started becoming a nationalist. And he was the editor of the main socialist paper, and he published this pro-war editorial, and it created a huge scandal, and he was kicked out of the party. So then he had like a few years where he kind of had no political affiliation, and he starts putting together this movement, which, again, it was brand new, and nobody knew what the heck he was doing. They thought, how can socialism go together with nationalism? It doesn't work. So people were very confused, and he was kind of figuring it out as he went along. So Mussolini is the first disruptor, and we see disruptors today. We had Berlusconi, we have Donald Trump in our country, and they come from outside of establishment politics, and they kind of invent new things, and they speak in different ways. They use media very effectively. And so Mussolini was the first to kind of come with this new doctrine that has remained with us ever since.
So Mussolini created fascism. So what is the origin of that word, fascism?
So fascism comes from a Latin word that meant a bundle or a group of something. And so in its origin, Mussolini didn't want fascism to be a party because he wanted, his first followers were veterans, and what they wanted to do is have these armed squads, they were called squadras, and go and bust the heads and kill socialists to, quote, restore order. Because there was a lot of labor. There was a lot of fear of communism because of the Russian Revolution, and there was a lot of fear of labor unrest, and there was a lot of labor unrest. So they posed as the forces of order, but they were, for the first 2 years, they were called fascist combat leagues, and so the Italian would be the fasci, and that's the root of the term.
One other area that I often hear fascism combined with is communism, and obviously there are two different areas. Could you tell me how communism was also different from fascism? I know you differentiated between Nazism and fascism, but I'm curious on how communism differentiated.
Yeah, so, you know, it's amazing 100 years later we're still living with the consequences of these new movements that came out of World War I, and communism came out of the Russian Revolution, which, you know, unseated the Russian monarchy and created this, you know, workers. This comes from Karl Marx, the theories from the 19th century, but, you know, having a revolution so the workers will own the means of production. And fascism came up as a kind of opposite. And whereas communism said, okay, everybody's equal, fascism said, no, we are for hierarchy, we are for order, and we are for industry and capitalism being able to kind of control the workers. So the more the left rose up, the more the right rose up to stop the left. And so the whole interwar period, like even in countries that didn't have a dictatorship, including the United States, you had a lot of left versus right-wing struggles going on, very, very intense.
So Benito Mussolini at one point was a journalist, if I'm not mistaken. You know, he was a reporter, and he wasn't political per se. What drove him into politics?
He actually was always very political because his father was a socialist, and he used to go to meetings with his father in the countryside, and he learned how to be a very good speaker and writer from his father and also his mother. They were very poor, but his mother was a school teacher, and so he had a lot of books around. And so when I said before he was outside of politics, it's just that he was inventing a new kind of politics. He wasn't part of the political establishment. So, but one thing that's really important, because there's an enormous movement right now all over the world that's it's connected to Holocaust revisionism. And your listeners may hear this, that the right is going around saying that fascism is a left-wing movement. And you see this on Facebook. The president of Brazil says it. Dinesh D'Souza, a right-wing propagandist in our country, says it. And this is kind of fake news in order to say that all the horrible violence of Nazism and fascism can be blamed on the left. So it's really important for your listeners that, you know, fascism may have come out of socialism in terms of a couple of ideas, but it was a right-wing movement, and its major enemy was the left from day one. I
actually want to follow up on that because you're mentioning how there's a revisionist history here, and I actually want to quote someone. So prominent conservative writer Jonah Goldberg actually in 2008, I'm sure as you know, published a book called Liberal Fascism, and he's arguing in this book that fascism is a left-wing movement because Nazis had socialism in the name, the National Socialist Party for abbreviation. So recently he doubled down on his argument, and I want to quote him directly here. He said, "Conservatism / classical liberalism in the Anglo-American tradition equal limited government, sovereignty of the individual moral and religious traditionalism, and free market economics. Therefore, fascism isn't right-wing." So you're just talking about how that's fake news. Could you explain to me how he's twisting these words around?
So it's good that you mentioned that book, because what's happened in our era, especially with Donald Trump in office, is that a lot of ideas that were kind of fringe have cycled to the mainstream, including white nationalism, which was always very strong in America, but it was not in the White House. But this business that fascism is somehow left-wing has been hugely, it's like the right-wing propaganda machine. And people like Dinesh D'Souza, he has an even bigger following than Jonah Goldberg. He has millions of, he makes documentary films, he publishes books. And all of these people are dedicating huge amounts of time to try and say that fascism was actually left-wing, when instead, yes, there's National Socialism, that was the name of the movement, but this was just a few ideas in practice, because we have to distinguish between ideas and reality. And from day one, in Italy and in Germany, public enemy number one of fascists everywhere is the left. And as soon as they were formed, they started killing the left. And so if you study fascism like me, it's outrageous that the right is saying things like this. And the purpose is, it's disturbing, because what they want to do is to clean their own hands, because the right wing is responsible for the Holocaust. It's responsible for all kinds of, fascist crimes. And if they can say that all of those crimes were left, that means that it plays into today's attempts to show that even liberals are, Trump calls them an angry leftist mob. So this is people should recognize this is a strategy, and it's a huge perversion of history. It's a huge problem. And so I was on Brazilian TV a week ago today, because the president of Brazil and the foreign minister of Brazil are going around saying that fascism was left-wing, so they came to my house to have me talk about that. So it's a talking point of the right all over the world now.
You've mentioned left-wing and right-wing. Could you define what a left-wing is versus a right-wing? Well,
traditionally, for the left, from socialism, communism, class was what mattered. You identified by social class, and the working class was the champions of the left, and because they were oppressed by capitalists. This is classic doctrine, let's say. For the right, nation is what matters. So when you hear leaders saying we must unify the nation, and they also try and have anti-labor policies, or they try and make the lives of common people or average people who are not rich difficult by taking away health insurance, this is a sign that you're dealing with a right-wing politician. So nation is what matters, and to the right, and class is what matters traditionally to the left.
So I want to follow up on that, because you're talking about how a right-wing movement is basically trying to destroy labor movements, and it's basically for the rich, the wealthiest people. But Donald Trump was elected president, and millions of people voted for him, and I can't imagine that every person that voted for him was loaded in cash. So, and then you could see the modern Republican Party, as it's been defined since probably after Eisenhower left presidency, that it was more for the wealthy, but the common man would constantly vote for that. So why do you think that is?
And that's always been the case. And one subset of that is, for example, all authoritarian rulers they're misogynist, and they're against women, and they take away female rights. They do all kinds of anti-woman things, but a lot of women vote for them throughout history, including for Trump. I mean, he's done less well than some others in the past. Because part of it is this kind of charisma that some of them have. They establish these emotional bonds with their followers. The other is that they promise things. It's very appealing, make America great again. So Mussolini was a journalist. Hitler wrote a lot of, he had Goebbels as advertising and marketer expert. And some of the most successful of these rulers who get people to vote for them who are then kind of screwed over by them are very good sloganeers. And they sell a very alluring package. Just like Trump did, he told workers that he was going to, increase jobs and open factories, like for Carrier air conditioning, and instead the factories have closed. So this is part of their seduction in a way, and it's very dangerous. And over people get swept away in this kind of utopian vision of the nation, making it great again. And then when it's too late, they realize that it was false.
So I want to go back in history and go back to Mussolini. What caused his rise to run the country? Because I believe he was democratically elected, if I'm not mistaken.
It's a very cautionary tale. So he had his fascist party. It became a party. And he was invited in by the equivalent of the GOP or the Democrats, the establishment politicians. They thought they could use him to get rid of the left. They liked the fact that Mussolini had squadrists who were killing people because they were the conservative elites. And the same thing happened in Germany. Hitler was also courted by these conservative elites who thought they could use him to do their dirty work and get rid of the left and then bring order. They all talk about order. So Mussolini was invited by the king to become prime minister in 1922. And then he had almost 3 years of being prime minister, and that's a very interesting window for people today because he joked about, being a dictator. He humiliated people. He cracked down on the press. A lot of the things that right-wing leaders do now who are in kind of democracies, and Trump has many, many similarities. I wrote about this for The Atlantic in 2016, the similarities of their personalities. And so Italy was a democracy, but he was chipping away at that democracy every single day. And then he came under suspicion of having murdered the leading socialist who was going to expose his financial corruption. And there was a special counsel, a Mueller equivalent. There was a special investigation that went on for months, and it was looking really bad for Mussolini. So he declared dictatorship to get out of that situation. And one of the lessons is that when you get authoritarians in office, they never leave, and they will do anything, even drag the country into ruin, kill people, blackmail in order to keep that power, because their only concern is themselves.
So you talked about how Mussolini and Hitler shared similarities in their rise and their knowledge and their propaganda. Your latest book is actually about propaganda came from Mussolini's government, specifically focusing on Hollywood as a generalization, documentaries. Mm-hmm. What drew your interest into doing a book on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, this is one of the, when I was saying before that I decided to study the Italy case because there wasn't so much done, I realized that there weren't very many books on fascist propaganda, and especially film propaganda. And Mussolini, so basically, newsreels and film were to Mussolini what Twitter is to Trump. He was an international star. He charmed people. He threatened. He knew how to use his body like an actor. He was incredibly skilled. And he built up this huge base by using film. So I thought, well, it's time for a book about that. So it's a huge subject, so I chose films about Mussolini's empire to kind of narrow it down, but I did both feature films and I did documentaries. And I looked at how the regime had this huge propaganda machine and how they, basically the principle of repetition, like Trump does, you repeat over and over again your slogans, how they organized society to make sure that, for example, Italy didn't have a very high literacy rate. A lot of Italians only spoke dialect. So film was perfect because you didn't have to read. So they knew their market, and they were very, very successful in their film industry. So it seemed like a good thing to write a book about.
So could you give me an example of one of the feature films that you covered in your book about that Mussolini's government put out?
Well, a lot of them, some of them actually nobody had ever written about, because after fascism, there were many people who didn't want those films to be seen because in some cases famous people had made them and nobody wanted to be reminded of their fascist past. So I had to do a lot of digging in archives. But one director, a couple of directors your listeners might know, Federico Fellini, who was just getting started in his career. He didn't make a whole film until after fascism, but his first experience behind the camera was in an imperialist war film in Libya. He traveled to Libya and he was allowed to shoot a couple of scenes. Another one who became very famous anti-fascist, Roberto Rossellini, who made Rome Open City. He made 3 fascist war propaganda films during World War II. One on the Navy, one on the Army, one on the Air Force. So I have extensive analyses of these. And I also show how he was of the generation that grew up under fascism, and he was very restless by World War II, and he started experimenting with kind of messages of dissatisfaction inside the propaganda, which is very interesting.
To follow up, Mussolini and Hitler, while they shared a lot of similarities, their relationship was kind of complex, where Hitler had written Mussolini letters praising him for his march on Rome, and he greatly admired the fascist movement he was pushing out and going for. Where Mussolini didn't really exactly view Hitler in the same light. He didn't, while publicly he would, say nice things about Hitler, while privately he kind of complained and didn't think much of him. Was this more of an egotistical thing, or was there something more deep than that?
Well, complex is an excellent word that you used, because they really did. They had like a love-hate relationship, and it's very. So you have this phenomenon with dictators, or people who are obviously enormous bullies. They see people, everyone is just something to be used, but they also can get intimidated and attached to figures they see as more important than them. And when they do, they can sometimes act against their self-interest, and certainly against their country's self-interest. So one might see today Trump's obsession with Putin, who has been very clear that Putin's job is to take down America and make it implode the way that the Soviet Union did. And Trump is like obsessed with him and believes his word over his own intelligence service. So the model for this was Mussolini and Hitler, because it became clear fairly early on in the late 30s that Hitler, the kind of alliance Hitler wanted, was not an equal alliance. He wanted Mussolini. He didn't think about invading him then. That came later. He invaded him in 1943. But he was going to be the top dog. And Mussolini, out of pride, and also these men do not take criticism. They arrange their governments so they get no real feedback. They hire their families. They have flatterers around them. They change their governments all the time, like revolving doors. So they don't get good management and advice. So Mussolini didn't listen to people who didn't want him to go in World War II, didn't want him to be so attached to Hitler. And yet he plowed on, and then Hitler eventually invaded him. So it's a real, cautionary tale, right? You go from Hitler admiring Mussolini to 10 years later invading Italy.
So what was Hitler's reason for invading Italy? Like you said, Hitler was a big admirer of Mussolini, and then obviously 10 years later, like you said, he invades. What caused him to change his mind to go invade someone he once admired?
Well, so they had Hitler invaded Poland, and World War II broke up in 1939. Italy wasn't ready to go into the war, but it was bound by the Axis Agreement, which was a military alliance. And so Mussolini kind of stalled, and he bought time, and if you look at his letters to Hitler, they're crazy. He's making excuses like, the dog ate my homework, we're going to be, entering soon, but we just need more time, and stalling. So then he has to go in the war in 1940, and they invade various countries, and they have joint control of Greece, also Yugoslavia. But Italy is having disastrous losses, and so in 1943, in July, Mussolini's own government, his own Grand Council, depose him, and he's out. And he's put in a prison, and he's moved around, and then he's put in this mountaintop prison, and Hitler decides to rescue him, because by then, it's 1943, and Hitler has established this enormous empire of satellite countries. And so he wants Italy to be a satellite. So he rescues Mussolini, very daring rescue, and he puts him in power in the Republic of Salo, and it's a puppet state, just like he has in Hungary, everywhere, in France, and with Vichy. So Italy becomes another puppet state, and then Italy splits, right? So you have the resistance going on in the north, and you have, an allied kingdom of Italy in the south, and it's a big mess. Italy ends up, Mussolini promised modernity, and Italians ended up living in caves after World War II. That's a parable.
You've mentioned earlier that we've seen a rise in authoritarianism and right-wing fascism politics worldwide. It looks like Italy's experiencing it again. You see it over in many other countries. What do you think is driving this? What is causing this?
I think, the classic story is that after the 2008 recession, you had these populist movements that were rising, and people were dissatisfied with what liberal democracy had to offer, and that is definitely true. But you also had the seeds of this, when communism ends in 1991, you have Berlusconi, who comes to power in 1994, and he brings back the fascists into government for the first time. No one, the fascist movements everywhere were like pariahs. right? You had laws, like in Germany, you were not allowed, it was against the law, you can't do the Hitler salute, all of it. It was a very important legal framework for keeping liberal democracy afloat because fascism had been so ruinous. And Berlusconi breaks all this. He brings the neo-fascists into government. They have like a center-right government, and he legitimizes them. So by the time, and he only lasts 6 months, but it's like the genie came out of the bottle. And then you have, starting in 2000, he comes back in 2001, and by then you have Putin. And Putin is one of these post-communists who has then gone to the right. Communism's over. But nationalism and the idea that you need a big population, imperialism, all of these things, Putin starts rehabilitating Stalin, not to rehabilitate communism, but the idea of authoritarian strong leaders. And today we have this very unfortunate situation where you have like all the inherited wisdom of communist authoritarianism, where you have Orban, who used to be a communist, Putin, and you have these right-wing leaders like Trump and Salvini, and the two have met together, and the enemy is liberal democracy. So you have all of the traditions of fascism coming back. You have all of the authoritarianism of communism. And no wonder liberal democracy is in trouble.
Something you mentioned that was interesting earlier, and again, this is history. You said that Mussolini's own government deposed him. They took him out of power. So it sounds like, in my opinion, that there were still checks and balances per se, that Mussolini didn't have a full control of his own country if his own government was able to take him out of power.
Well, this can happen to any leader. Mussolini had a grand council. I mean, every leader has some kind of, even if they hardly meet, like a parliament. But it's not that unusual for a kind of strong leader to get overthrown. Like military coups, I'm writing a book on strongmen, and I have some military leaders. The average time that someone who comes to power via military coup, it's only 4 years, and then somebody else overthrows him. So it's actually more common than we think to have it happen. But the reason that he got overthrown is that Italy was losing the war. Had Italy not gone into the war, maybe Mussolini would have been like Franco. Because Franco in Spain, he stayed out of the war, and he ruled till 1975.
We've kind of been talking about this, and with authoritarian strongmen and right-wing authoritarianism associated with fascism, and we've mentioned Trump a couple of times. Do you think Trump is a fascist? Is the Republican Party, because we know there are members in the Republican Party that are very right-wing, like Steve King is pretty much an avowed neo-Nazi. Mm-hmm. It's not like that's very hidden, it's very public. Mm-hmm. So would you say that Trump would be a fascist, or?
No, so my ethics on this, my stance on this is I will not call Trump a fascist, because Trump is not, no one today is, hardly anybody is interested in having a one-party fascist dictatorship. So, if Mussolini were here today, he wouldn't be a classic fascist anymore. So I like to reserve the word fascist for those historical leaders. That said, Trump uses a lot of the tactics used by fascism, from violence to propaganda to intimidation. They are not specific only to fascism, and they return throughout the century. So a lot of techniques that Trump uses are very similar to Mussolini's. And the reason I started writing about Trump and ended up covering the campaign for CNN Opinion and doing all of this media stuff is because I saw a video of Trump at a rally, and he was doing the loyalty oath, and he was having the negative chants, and I thought, uh-oh, this is very, very familiar. So I started writing about Trump in 2015. I was one of the earliest people to write about him, and how he used propaganda also, how he would retweet images on Twitter, and all of this was totally understandable. So he uses what I've called the authoritarian playbook, which is a set of tools that all authoritarians use, that like attacking judges, trying to reframe the bureaucracy, demanding loyalty, having this kind of emotional bond with rulers, having a personality cult. All of these things go on whether it's 1920s or 2020.
In your opinion, do you think that he's intentionally taking pages out of these authoritarian books, or is this just because he seems to just kind of have a very egotistical view of himself and how things are done, and so it seems like he kind of stumbles into authoritarianism, but not intentionally looking to grab power?
Yeah. It's a really interesting question, and I get asked it a lot. On the one hand, all of these men have similar personalities, unfortunately for us. You can take a quote that describes the governing style of, I could put it on a PowerPoint and you'll think this is Trump, and instead it's Gaddafi, it's Mussolini, it's Mobutu. So they're all very egotistical. They're all very insecure. They hire their families, the things I said before about not having flattery. So Trump is naturally given to this because he conducted his business in somewhat of the same way. However, there's a reason that Trump only admires autocrats. The only politicians he admires are, the Chinese president, Putin, Erdogan in Turkey. He openly admires authoritarian leaders and the way they do business. And he's very upfront about that. It's also interesting that his first wife, Ivana, as we know, Trump is not a reader. Except he likes to read news about himself, but otherwise he's not a reader. She said he had, when he used to read more in his youth, he had a book of Hitler's speeches in his bedside cabinet. So, and as we know, Trump is a white nationalist. He's been a racist his whole life, and he knows what he's doing with the racial politics and kind of ethno-nationalism. That's why he hired Steve Bannon. That's why you have Stephen Miller. That's why all this stuff is going on about immigration. So it's a little bit of a combination of both. But I am always against people underestimating Trump, because if people say he's chaotic, he's crazy, he's very methodical on certain things. And you can look, the things he said in 2015, they've happened now. They've already happened. So he's got a plan.
Interesting.
Scary, but and this is why I wrote several op-eds for CNN around the time of the inauguration, including before the inauguration. And one of them was predicting what he was going to do called Trump is Following the Authoritarian Playbook. I did a series of them every 6 months, and every single thing came true. Not because I'm a psychic, it's because he fits this model of rule.
So, actually, earlier this year, because you were talking about how Trump has this love affair for other authoritarian rulers globally, and we've talked about Putin, Erdogan, and President Xi over in China. But one of them that you actually wrote about, who was recently elected, is actually over in Brazil, and that's Bolsonaro. Mm-hmm. And you wrote how he's actually a lot more dangerous than Trump. Could you explain to me how Bolsonaro is more dangerous than Trump is?
Well, one of the things that's making America a laboratory of so many things right now is because we have been able to take democracy for granted. We've had plenty of episodes of hoodwinking the public, like the Iraq War. We had Watergate. But we have not had authoritarian rule here. Brazil had an over 20-year military dictatorship, which used torture. Think of every bad thing you can think about a military dictatorship, Brazil did it. And Bolsonaro is a military man. He comes from the military. And during his campaign, he campaigned partly on cleaning up the country, anti-corruption, which is all fake. But he also campaigned on an anti-left program saying that if I get to power, these people are going to be killed. And in fact, he's only been in power a few months, and he just ordered the Brazilian military to commemorate the dictatorship. That's a very, very serious statement. Now, here's an example when we talked about is Trump a fascist. I don't think that Bolsonaro is going to suspend all rule of law and become a military dictator, because you don't need to do that today. The new authoritarians, as I call them, they have elections, like Putin, they're fixed, right? Mm-hmm. But they have them. So Bolsonaro doesn't need to become a military dictator, but he is clearly intent on restoring certain violence, and he dedicated his vote in Parliament to a known torturer. In fact, the man who tortured the former president of Brazil. So the presence in Brazil of the military dictatorship makes him a lot more dangerous.
Interesting. So one of the other issues that we're seeing globally, and it's come around to the United States, and then I'm trying to figure out how I word this delicately without coming across wrong, is that we see a very tightrope walk with the U.S. relationship with Israel because of the relationship between Israel and Palestine. But one of the biggest issues with the U.S. Trump-Israel relationship that's often criticized, and depending on how you criticize it, again, because there's all sorts of criticism that's based in anti-Semitism, but we've seen that Benjamin Netanyahu's party recently formed a coalition with the Likud party that's considered modern-day neo-Nazi party. Which, to me, it's a very interesting parallel because Israel was created after World War II for the survivors of the Holocaust. Now, for an Israeli government to form a coalition party with, again, neo-Nazis, it seems very dangerous. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, no longer than maybe 2 weeks ago, one of Netanyahu's, a minister of the government, attractive woman, she did a video in which she sprays herself with perfume. She pretends to be a model. And at the end, you discover that the name of the perfume is fascism. I'm not making this up. When all of us saw it on Twitter, we thought this was a deep fake or God knows what. It's real. She sprays herself with this fascist perfume, and she says, if this is fascism, it smells to me like democracy. So she was participating in this idea that right-wing politics are real freedom. Democracy is actually a left-wing tyrannical thing. And this was kind of an emblem of where we are today, not only in certain circles in Israel, but everywhere, where you can actually make a video as a minister of the government spraying yourself with a perfume that you call fascism, and it smells so good. And the one thing I would say about this, Trump's been very, very clear. This is one of the things where, no, he's not mad, he has a method. He's been very clear about his relationship with Netanyahu, moving the capital to Jerusalem, and this is through Jared Kushner, of course. But in general, when Trump is one of many right-wing people in the world, but he's the American president, and as such has an enormous effect and an influence. And it legitimates other people to act badly. So with his refusal to denounce the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, there's a million things like that don't get the same news. And so, of course, Netanyahu, who's, plagued by scandal and corruption, has a very powerful friend. And so he sees Trump moving to the right and proud of it, refusing to denounce the people in Charlottesville. And by the way, a big clue, which really disturbed me, his first January in office, 2017, the administration released a Holocaust remembrance statement. And I ended up writing for CNN on it because it didn't mention Jews. Nowhere in the Holocaust remembrance statement were Jews mentioned. I thought, well, you really have to try very hard not to mention Jews in a Holocaust remembrance statement. What's going on? And it actually connects to the same business where you're trying to kind of forget about Nazism being anti-Semitic and having all these crimes. So this told me that no matter that Trump was using anti-Semitism, which he did during the campaign, that's one thing, and having a right-wing alliance with Netanyahu is another, right?
Mm-hmm. Late last year, and I know you know who this is, Yale philosopher Jason Stanley released his latest book called How Fascism Works. And throughout his book, he details on his view of how fascism comes about and what fascism politics are, etc. Fantastic book, and I know you've spoken with him at many conferences. So,
we tend to be paired with things. Mm-hmm.
So one of the chapters, and you've spoken on this a bit too, that was really interesting to me, talks about a mythic past, on how fascists and dictators and authoritarians create this mythic past to talk about. And it parallels with Mussolini. Sure, as you know, Mussolini talked about how great Rome was at one point, and again, this mythic past. Why is it that authoritarians and rulers, because that's all Trump's slogan is make America great again, that America isn't great, depending on how you view it, and obviously those views can change, but that there's this past when America was great, and he never necessarily defines when that is, and surprisingly no one ever asks him. That's always kind of caught me off guard, is no one ever asks him when he thinks that is. But to get back to the point, why is this commonly used? Because actually it's a two-part thing. One is that the first thing is that you say that your country's in a crisis. And in fact, a lot of Trump's important speeches, like during the campaign and even his inauguration speech, it was a total downer. He was talking about, in one speech he said America is like a friend dying of cancer.
It's a rusted wreck heap. It's, he was trying to create this depressing image of we're getting taken for granted, we're being used, and we're being victimized by other nations. This is all, it's called negative politics. So step one is that you diagnose this disaster. Step two, you come in as the savior. And everybody, of course, all your opponents are, you lock her up, they're all complicit, and you come in as the savior, and you have this bright, shiny object of making the nation great again. Because you can only make the nation great again more effectively if you've said that the nation is in the dumps. If everything's fine, there's nothing to make great again. So it's a two-part thing. It's this politics of negativity, and then it's this myth, like, of a golden future, right?
Right.
So and unfortunately for us, it has, every single ruler I have studied has done it, and it works. It works on people very well. They really go for it, because these men, they prey on people who often they don't have much hope, and they see this showman. He's a very practiced performer, and he's going to promise them this and that, and they fall for it.
So, you've been a very vocal critic of Donald Trump. I mean, we've talked about him throughout this interview, and clearly you're not a fan, and you're very concerned about the things he does. And actually, your criticism has drawn you some attention in the wrong way, to where at one point you actually had to have a full-time security guard at your office because of threats you received. Could you tell me a little bit what was going on there? What happened?
Well, when you're in the public eye, you can attract all kinds of attention, and you can have unwanted attention, and it can be political or other. So, like many people writing, I was getting some threats, and so, I had to have some protection for that period of time, and I moved my office to a more secure location. And I'm a freelancer. I have a full-time job at NYU, but my Trump criticisms are freelance. I don't work full-time for CNN. I'm on their website, but I don't work for them. So there have been many people who are in this situation this is why some people don't want to write. They don't want to speak out because it can be daunting to do so. And that's part of their plan. They want to intimidate you. I had what many people had, because I have a Jewish last name. I had the swarming by neo-Nazis during the campaign, and many of us have had that. So this is they want you to be quiet and not talk anymore.
With the election of Donald Trump, it's often said that America is facing a crisis of democracy. Do you agree with that? Do you think that America had this strong democracy before he came to power?
I like the way you've put that. That's a thoughtful way to put it. There are many ways we can look at Obama's administration, for example, the use of drones, and perhaps see it. Obama was much more hawkish than many people think. He was made by the right to seem weak as possible, and they never accepted him because he was a black man and actually biracial. But there's no doubt that Donald Trump is trying to erode what was a healthy democracy, and Obama was a staunch defender of liberal democracy and civil rights and all the other things that go with the democratic agenda. Very staunch. His national security, he was more conservative, and his drone policy was controversial. But there's zero doubt he was not for voter suppression. He was not corrupt, and all of the things that Trump will stop at nothing to make sure the Mueller report is not released, just like Mussolini and his tax returns. So Trump is slowly, and with the full enabling of the GOP, because it's not just Trump. Trump could go away tomorrow, and the GOP has become profoundly authoritarian. So it's a bigger problem than Trump. In fact, they are the cause of this mess, because Donald Trump has always been who he says he is. He said while he was on the campaign trail that he could shoot someone and not lose any followers. And I remember thinking, well, who does that? Who says they're going to shoot someone on the campaign? It's not a very good way to campaign. But it is if you're Duterte, it is if you're Erdogan or you're Putin. This is what they do. But then it was up to the GOP not to give this man the nomination. It seemed like not a good sign that they gave someone who talked about murdering someone. So Trump has been a crook from day one. He's said that he's allied with violence, and so we should not be surprised at anything that's happened, and it's like drip, drip, drip. He is undermining every day with consistency our democracy with his slogans about fake news, with his bureaucratic appointments. Everything he's doing is to weaken democracy, and we're in the middle of it, so we maybe don't step back and see how much damage has already been done.
So, I'll end it on this. You just talked about how Donald Trump, has been enabled by the Republican Party, that even without him in power, they pretty much are in lockstep with his agenda. His agenda just matches up, just coincidentally, in a sense, matches up with theirs, weakening labor laws, voting suppression, civil rights cases. And so, the big election, for the presidential election is obviously in next year in 2020, and let's say the Democrats win presidential election, and God willing, whatever expression you'd like to use, that things go smoothly, transition goes smoothly, and Trump leaves office. That still leaves the Republican Party in Congress, whether they have full control of the Senate or House, or none, or split control. What is the solution to changing that? Because it seems like they've been on this path for a very long time. I mean, Richard Nixon was no fan of the civil rights movement, and it seems, again, that's been part of their agenda for the longest time. So how does that change?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult because a lot of the things happening now, it's not just the politicians, it's the Koch brothers, it's very powerful, wealthy forces who are actually trying to have a kind of cultural shift in the country, and they have established the Turning Point organization on campuses to train students to become right-wing. It's a big kind of cultural revolution that the right has in mind. And banning abortion is one thing. There are many, policy points, but it's a big... The Kochs have invested millions and millions for years in this agenda. So it's going to be difficult to just, even if we get rid of Trump electorally, it's going to be very difficult to reverse this. That's why I use the genie out of the bottle. And the only, history teaches that the only way you get, politicians are opportunists, and what they care about is staying in office. If they're voted out, they lose their power. They can go be lobbyists and do other things. But if they see that it's not going to pay anymore, and the climate is shifting back the other way, you may see some moderate voices who have lost out. Jeff Flake is now, his family is getting death threats because of Trump has incited this. You may see, he's not in office anymore, but you may see the Jeff Flakes gain more power if things are shifting back the other way, and Republicans think that being hardline is going to not be of use to them anymore.
To follow up on that real quick, because you mentioned Jeff Flake and his family getting death threats, and you mentioned moderation, but wouldn't it be fair to be critical of Jeff Flake, where he may have been vocally critic of Donald Trump, but it's not like he ever stood in his way of any legislation that Donald Trump wanted?
That's right. He's the perfect example, and to some extent John McCain as well, where they spoke, they said very important things. They were verbally a moral corrective to what's going on, and however the voting record, they did not break ranks with their party. So that's why I find it all the more interesting to show how the climate's gotten worse, that Jeff Flake is under this kind of threat, because in practice he voted with the party most of the time, and yet he's still getting, because Trump has to have, he's like a mafia leader, you must have absolute loyalty. That's all that matters. And any speaking out, even if because a lot of politicians would say, okay, he's saying this, but what is he doing? And the fact that he voted with the party, okay, because what matters is the vote. That's how you affect change. Trump, any kind of dissension from his cult is heresy, basically. So this is why Jeff Flake is under this kind of attack. That's a sign of deterioration of the civil society.
Once again, I would like to thank Ruth Ben-Ghiat for taking time out of her busy schedule to talk to me about the history of fascism and the disturbing reemergence of fascist politics, domestically and globally. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. Thank you.